So you have gone through all the materials that I've sent you, and you've read all the book chapters that I suggested, and therefore I'm assuming you already have a rough answer to these questions. That is, what is sociolinguistics? And you must have also felt that your answer is by no means definitive. And that is primarily because sociolinguistics covers a very vast array of subjects, and it is also expanding. So in this presentation, what we will try to do is to define the subject, get a rough understanding of how to organize the topics, learn about some of the questions and concepts that was important in the early days of sociolinguistics, and how it all began. That is how from regional dialect survey we went into the realm of social dialect survey. This would be the most commonly repeated definition of sociolinguistics, that is studying the relationship between language and society, and also the most vague. It doesn't say much. So what we will do is to first try to understand how sociolinguistics is different from the traditional area of linguistics, that is core linguistics. First of all, it uses non-linguistic data. It uses data such as social status, age, sex, etc., and try to understand how it impacts the language use of in the society. Secondly, it accesses feelings about language. As we have seen in the Martha's Vineyard, how the islanders use a certain variation of a diphthong to project their islander identity. So this was not at all accepted in linguistics before sociolinguistics. And then it studied change synchronically, which Lebov did in Martha's Vineyard and in New York City, and many sociolinguists did afterwards, is that they used the free variation, the so-called free variation, and treated them as conditional variants of the same variable, and it depends on several social factors. And based on that, they were trying to predict how the language is changing. That is, they were studying change in progress, which was never done before. For historical linguistics, it was a must that change has to be studied diachronically. That is, you have to take data from two different points of time and then study them to understand language change. Finally, it does not treat idiolect or dialect as a coherent, consistent system. That is to say, it refuses to accept that one person will have only one variant of language assigned to him. That is, this person will change the language depending on the context, depending on the interlocutor, depending on many other social factors. So all of us, as individuals and as a group, have a repertoire of different variants of language. And we take those different variants and use them depending on what the situation is. Miriam Meyerhoff's comments on her introductory textbook on sociolinguistics reflects how complex and vast the subject is. There is no way of defining it in one simple sentence. Labov's definition is even more interesting. He consistently said that there is no such thing as sociolinguistics because it is linguistics. If you want to study language, there's no way that you can study it without paying attention to the practices that is situated in the society. But then it creates one problem, because when you say that everything that is studying the relationship between language and society is sociolinguistics, there is no end to this. There's no end to this, and some scholars found it a little difficult to accept that everything that is studied in relation to language and society has to be sociolinguistics. For example, Peter Tradkill here said that there are certain things that are sociological and not linguistic. These are not sociolinguistics but sociology of language. And from there, we come going into the next topic, where this vast array of topics is being divided in two main categories, that is sociolinguistics, that is the study of language in relation to society, and sociology of language, that is the study of society in relation to. So to understand the difference between these two, micro-sociolinguistics is what some scholars would say the real sociolinguistics, whereas macro-sociolinguistics is really sociology of language. Whereas both have the same topic of study, both studies relationship between language and society, the aim is different. The first one tries to understand the structure of language and how it is impacted by the society. The second one would understand the social structure and what language has to do with it. So we have already seen Hudson's definition, the study of language in relation to society and study of society in relation to language. Some scholars would say that the topic that comes under micro-sociolinguistics has to be studied by the linguists, and macro-sociolinguistics has to be studied by the sociologists, not linguists. But of course, we don't have to agree with that. Now, Fasold wrote two textbooks, a two-volume textbook, one of which concentrated on the language part and the other on society. I have already suggested that you should get hold of this book and study this. Let's see how he organizes the topics in these two books. In the Linguistics of Society, he has 11 chapters consisting of societal multilingualism, diglossia, qualitative formulas, statistics, quantitative analysis, language attitude, language choice, language maintenance and shift, language planning and standardization, language planning cases, vernacular language education. Whereas under sociolinguistics of language, there is address forms, ethnography of communication, discourse, language and sex, linguistic pragmatics, conversational implicature, more on linguistic pragmatics, Pidgin and Creole languages, linguistic variations, and some applications of sociolinguistic change. So the early studies, that is studying language variation with an aim to understand language change in progress, would come under sociolinguistics of language. But see here, statistics and quantitative analysis, these all were also applied in language variation studies by Labov himself. So it's not very easy to have a very clear distinction between these two categories. Not only these categorization, strict attempt of categorizing and strict way of assigning one to the linguists, the other to the sociology is difficult, but it is also quite unnecessary. As Wardo said, that sociolinguistics that deliberately refrains from drawing conclusions about society seems to be unnecessarily restrictive. Just as restrictive as indeed a sociology of language that deliberately ignores the discoveries about language made in the course of sociological research. So, whereas we should be aware of the categorizations, we should also understand that there are some critical points. There are some criticisms about the categorization as well. Now we come to the questions and concepts that were important in the early days of sociolinguistics. Now we come to some of the important questions that were there in the early days of sociolinguistics, and they're still very much pertinent now. The first question was about, of course, they were all about varieties of language. The first question was that who is using which form? And that says a lot about the society as well as the language user and as well as about the language varieties. The second question is who are they using with? Not just the user of the language varieties, but the addressee, the interlocutors. They're important. And why do some forms emerge as the winner form and the others are gradually lost in course of time? Then the question about how much social information is there in those language varieties. What do they tell us about the speaker? What do they tell us about their social status, their age, their sex? Some other social information is there. And then how much can we change or control the language that we use? Is it always a conscious decision about which variety of language we are using at the moment? Or is it that some of it comes automatically? Is it like we have no control over that? So these are the questions that was important in the early days of sociolinguistics. Now, to understand, to try to find the answer to these questions, we have to first have some clear understanding about some certain concepts. These concepts are already clear to you, but still we have to revise them because it is important for sociolinguistics. We must first understand that language is a variety in which is comprehensible to speakers, incomprehensible to speakers of the other language. And a standard language is a subvariety with high social status. And we have already studied that earlier in our previous semesters, that this definition can be looked into critically and it can be questioned. But this is a working definition that we'll have to start with. Now, the distinction between accent and dialect. These terms are often used in a general way in natural conversation, but for a linguist we must have clear distinction about these two. That accent is about the pronunciation, not about anything else, and it may give certain indication about the speaker's geographical origin. That is, it may give some indication about the speaker's dialect, but dialect is the entire subvariety which has accent as well as many other, it may have many other differences in other levels of language. And then we have this very useful term variety, which is a very neutral term. It can refer to either language or dialect or a variation, and it does not draw distinction between the two. And it also does not have the negative connotations that the term dialect carries. So this term variety is very useful for sociolinguistic investigations. And then we already know this term style and register, that is a variation in individual speech that correlates with different contextual cues such as the addressee, the social context, personal goals, etc. Now, for the early days of sociolinguistics, which was basically studying the variations of language and trying to arrive at certain conclusion about the language change in progress, these are very important. First of all, you have to identify a variable which has different representations in actual language use. This is called variable. So variable is an abstract idea, and it is realized by at least two realizations. Now these realizations are variants, and the variants are not free variants, as we learned in earlier days of linguistics. All the variants that cannot be explained by their linguistic environment are called free variants. But for sociolinguistics, these free variants are not free. They are constrained by certain independent factors, also called independent variables, that controls them. So, suppose in New York City, the independent variable of social status controlled the variable of R. Well, that would control where R is pronounced and where it is not pronounced. So finally, we learn a bit about how from regional dialectology this study of social dialectology came about. So dialect geography used this method. They first recorded the words and pronunciation of elderly speakers in remote villages. There is this term NORM, Native Old Rural Male, they were their informants, and typically a field worker will go to them, identify the norms, NORMs that is, and they will present them with a list of statements and words, and they will ask them that how you pronounce them, and then these are recorded and transcribed, and then they will see the differences in pronunciation in two different areas. And finally, they will trace their findings on a map, and they will use a different map for each feature, and then draw lines that separate areas of use, and these are called isoclaws. One of the most famous isoclaws is that of Kentman-Sutton isoclaws, and you are familiar with that in your historical linguistics class. Following the method that we learned about in the previous slide, there were quite a few famous dialect geography projects or dialect atlas projects were taken up in USA and Europe. One of the most famous early large-scale projects were done in 19th century, precisely from 1897 to 1901, and it was published from 1902 to 10. But it was taken up by Jules Guilleron. It was called Atlas Linguistique de la France, and he had only one field worker, Edmond. So Edmond's job was to bicycle all around this dialect study area, and he would identify older speakers in small villages, and will ask them to pronounce the local versions of a selected number of words, and then he will transcribe them in phonetic script, and that in this way the isoglosses would be created and a whole dialect atlas would be created. It was very famous, and there are many other large-scale studies that was taken up in Europe during this time. One of the important study, and important for a different reason, is the Atlas of Iberian Peninsula. And one of the field workers working in this project was Aníbal Otero. And when he was doing this project, when this project was going on, a military coup happened, and Otero was arrested. And his notebook was full of transcriptions written in IPA script, International Phonetic Alphabet script, and it was concluded that he must be a spy with a notebook full of codes, and he was sentenced to death by firing squad. This was later converted to life imprisonment on the testimony of scholars that codes are actually linguistic transcriptions, but he was still in jail. And Otero continued linguistic research in prison and for most part of his life, taking fellow prisoners as his informants. Now, while these large-scale dialect studies were going on, some scholars found that it is not enough just to tally variations, language variations with geographical variations. For example, Dave Britton, who worked in Northeast London, he wrote actually that some linguistic variability could be related to non-linguistic factors. Then Louis Gauchat in 1905 said that, noted that age and gender related variations are there in the area that he was working in Switzerland. However, William Lebow was the first to systematically study social variation, and he also had a complete set of well-defined methods of studying them, and which is very innovative, and which as we have already discussed, it is very innovative and very novel in linguistics. So these are the famous works by Lebow. You are already familiar with these works in your historical linguistics class, but of course we cannot conclude a sociolinguistics introductory class without a mention of his famous departmental store study. As a pilot project to his large New York City study, large-scale study, Lebow did a short study in 3 departmental stores in New York. The first one is of Saks, an advertisement of Saks, current advertisement from their website. You can see in this slide. The next store that he selected was Macy's. So this is an advertisement of Macy's, the second store from their website. And I think it's quite apparent how stores are different, how the clothes and the apparels and whatever they're selling are less expensive, and how they are targeting a different set of customers. So while Lebov selected these three stores, he selected them following a proper scientific procedure to ensure that these three shops represent three different social status. The third store's client has now run out of business, and it was the lowest ranked store among these three socially. Lebov's hypothesis was that certain linguistic variables vary dependent on certain social variables such as social status, age, sex, etc. And one of the variables that are varying in New York City at the moment is the pronunciation of raw in preconsonantal or word final cases. In standard American English, in such cases, the raw would be dropped. But Lebov had an assumption, had a hypothesis that this raw is making a comeback, and it is more prevalent in the speech of the higher class people, and there is a change in progress. That is, the society as a whole is moving towards the pronunciation of this raw in these linguistic places, and rather than the standard pronunciation, dropping raw in such cases. To test his hypothesis, what he did is he went to the stores which is ranked according to their status, and he asked the workers the same question, of which the answer would be fourth floor. So he would first find out what is there in the fourth floor, and he would ask the worker, where can I find that? Now, you can see that in this chart there are two bars of the results given. This is because he asked the same question twice. This is the first bar where he asked, for example, where is the lady's shoes? Fourth floor. The first one, the clean bar represents fourth. The shaded bar represents floor. That is a raw the number of times that raw is pronounced in these words. Now he would pretend that he didn't hear it properly and then ask again, sorry, what did you say? So they would say fourth floor. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to see whether there is any conscious change in pronunciation in these these two. As he hypothesized that this change is happening above the level of awareness. People are aware that they are pronouncing it. People there are aware that this is the prestige variant. So as you can see, the results show that R does indeed vary with social status. The shop that was, the departmental store that was categorized as the lowest status has the lowest percentage of R equal to 1, and then it grows from there. And then there is also a change in first and second pronunciation. That also shows that change is happening in the level, above the level of awareness. People are aware that they should be pronouncing like that. They should be pronouncing raw in such places, except for sex, perhaps, where there is very little change. There is an explanation for that, which we'll discuss later in some other classes. And there is also another thing, the wide words are consistently lower than the shaded word. This shows that there is a linguistic element to this as well. That is, the preconsonantal raw is pronounced less than the word final raw. And this study was replicated by one of Lebov's students exactly 20 years after he did it. And it was found that the change is still happening in the same way, that is that it is higher in the higher status stores and lower in the lower status store. But what has happened in between this time is that 20% increase has happened. So Lebow was indeed correct about uh, predicting the change in progress. Now, why is this new? Lebow's method is different from the traditional dialectologists because he actually recorded what the respondents said, not what they said they say. For example, in case of traditional dialectology, the field worker will ask you, what do you call this? And whatever I say I call this, they will have to record it. But Lebov tried to develop a methodology in which people speak unconsciously. People are not conscious about reporting what they say, but they are just conversing, and they're saying the way they're saying. They're not reporting their speech. Okay? And then, of course, this is the most vital one. He found or investigated correlation between social variables and linguistic variables, and he also showed that synchronic change can be studied as a root of the diachronic change. It is possible to study change in progress. So we talked a little bit about the definition of sociolinguistics. We talked a bit about the binary categorization of the different topics of sociolinguistics. We talked a little bit about concepts and questions that were important in the early days of sociolinguistics, and how from traditional dialectology, social dialectology appeared, and how it all began, how sociolinguistics began. Now the final question is, what do we aim to achieve through all this? Why do we study sociolinguistics at all? One answer is, of course, that it is part of your syllabus. You have to study it. But more importantly, we are already trained as linguists. We understand now how language operates and how to analyze it. And what we know from our experience of being a human being is that language as a mode of socialization encompasses many, many information. And a course in sociolinguistics gives us the tool to understand and analyze the world better, as it is encapsulated in language and linguistic issues that we encounter every day. So hopefully by the end of this course, you will be able to understand the world around you with a new ability, armed with some new tools in your hand.